One of the most memorable parts of a Zelda game is its dungeons. Temples lost within dark forests, sanctuaries deep within volcanoes, underwater caverns to literal cities in the sky. They play a crucial role in both the game's story and progression, acting as tests for the hero in the form of enemies, puzzles, mazes, new items, and of course, bosses. But these iconic challenges took a complete change in direction with the most recent game, Breath of the Wild. Rather than having linear focused dungeons, we got open divine beasts, which could be tackled in any order, but due to how story infused they were, it took away almost every feeling of a Zelda dungeon for many. And with a sequel to Breath of the Wild being on the way, many of us avid Zelda fans are curious as to how dungeons will be tackled in the sequel. Will they be open and generic again? Will they return to the classic linear style? Or could they introduce a new idea of mine? Hybrid dungeons. Oh, and you know what? Yes you are one lovely human being for being here and taking your time to watch my video. I can't say it enough, but thank you. I really appreciate you guys. Be sure to go grab yourself a snack or drink and show me them on my social media to get featured right here, and let's look into the idea of hybrid dungeons in the Breath of the Wild sequel. As we know with the most recent installment, Breath of the Wild, the dungeons we know and love were thrown right out of the window for a more open and simple approach. Whilst they worked really well in terms of fitting into the story, they didn't really work all that well as actual dungeons for a large majority of fans. Love them or hate them, they have nothing on the classic dungeons of the series. Some of the best examples of what makes the classic dungeons so good is the themes. They are all typically elemental or geographically themed. For example, the Goron Mines from Twilight Princess is a fire dungeon, the Spirit Temple from Ocarina of Time is a desert-based dungeon, and the Shadow Temple from Ocarina of Time is a, well, scary blood horror house that gives you nightmares as an adult themed dungeon. My point is, one of the key factors to making a good dungeon is a theme. The Divine Beasts felt the same. They were all designed around Sheikah tech, and like I said earlier, that worked story-wise, but as an actual dungeon made them feel plain. Along with that, classic dungeons have a ton of enemies, puzzles, and just general challenges. The Divine Beasts were a little too open in my opinion. So what we are going to do is take the best of both dungeons and combine them together into what I believe would create the perfect balance between the classic and new dungeons, without making them feel out of place in an open world Zelda game, which is where the series is headed. So the foundations of my idea begin with a few things. This is theoretically talking about Breath of the Wild 2, but does also apply to future installments. We will begin by talking mainly about the format and pathway of the dungeons, then get into the meat and bones such as the enemies, puzzles, contents, items, and so on. These dungeons begin by having 3 available from the get-go. By this I mean after the game's tutorial section. You will be made knowledgeable of these dungeons' whereabouts and lightly hinted towards them by key characters, perhaps Princess Zelda. These first 3 dungeons are absolutely mandatory, but they can be done in any order you like. This takes the classic format of the first 3 dungeons, such as Ocarina of Time's Great Deku Tree, Dodongo's Cavern, and Jabu Jabu's Belly, but makes them open. You can freely go to do other stuff away from these first 3 dungeons, but the main story will not progress without them. The contents of these dungeons will be similar to the shrines seen in Breath of the Wild, but with more character to them. They would be more along the lines of cavern systems with small dungeons within them. Nothing too special, just 4 or 5 puzzles, a few enemy rooms, and then a boss. These 3 are sort of supposed to introduce the player to what's to come in terms of dungeons, without going too heavy, hence why I think they should all be cave-like dungeons, similar to how the shrines were all Sheikah tech. Following these 3 starter dungeons, we will learn some key story information. Similar to how in Ocarina of Time we begin to learn more about Ganondorf and the Ocarina of Time following the first 3 dungeons. But in this hybrid dungeons idea, after we complete the first 3, we will gain the information on how to find Ganondorf. But we need a map. A map that was torn into 5 pieces and locked away within 5 more dungeons across the land. The reason for this could be that whenever Ganondorf was sealed away deep beneath the ground, a map was made by the royal family or someone associated with them so they could know where to go if necessary to find Ganondorf, but was torn into pieces and hid across the land to ensure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. But the catch is that this was hundreds of thousands of years ago. The dungeons have fell into decline and been overrun by monsters. Some of these further 5 dungeons will be found within the existing Breath of the Wild map, but others will be found out with Hyrule. Out at sea, beyond the Gerudo Desert, and across the canyons in Outer Hyrule, meaning there would only be 2 of the further 5 in the current land of Hyrule. As mentioned, these 5 dungeons would all contain a piece of a map, and once all pieces are obtained, we can begin working our way to Ganondorf. This is what makes them hybrids. Yes, they will be more true to the classic dungeons on the inside, which we will cover very shortly, but will be available to do in any order. You can do the first 3 in any order, and then the further 5 in any order. This would work around everything else within the game. You can't just track down the final boss area without completing these 5 dungeons, as they all require a piece of the puzzle to get to the final boss. Everything else in the game will operate as an open world game would. You will still be able to do other big main quests such as rebuild Hyrule alongside Princess Zelda, explore the outer regions of the land, and study the Zonai if you really want to. This ensures the game won't feel linear, whilst also having linear-ish dungeons. Now that we have a format, let's get into the contents of these dungeons. As I mentioned, those first 3 dungeons would sort of act as introduction dungeons, whilst also being proper ones. None of that silly tutorial nonsense. They will shape up like other dungeons, but with a bit more guidance. Taking on a dark, dim lit cavern interior would fit really well too, as it's likely the game will have a lot of that featured based on the emphasis given in the reveal trailer. It might seem a bit too quick, but these first 3 dungeons will include 3 key items, almost in a similar fashion as to how Link gained the Sheikah Slate abilities at the beginning of Breath of the Wild. But this will bring back that achievement hunter feeling, as they will be hidden within a chest, and yes, that classical chest open music will play. I can't wait to hear it again. I'm not 100% sure what these first 3 items should be, but I'd like them to be a grappling hook for traversal within caves, a lantern to light up areas, and a hammer of sorts for breaking through rock and such. This will also bring back the classic item feel, rather than the more or less handed to you Sheikah Slate abilities. I've picked these 3 items in particular as we are talking about this in terms of Breath of the Wild 2, but obviously they would be changed up for other future installments. Those 3 items will be crucial to taking on the further 5 dungeons, as I think the second set of dungeons should have a varying difficulty. One thing the Divine Beasts really lacked was difficulty. You more or less just walked through them and did a few puzzles with very little enemies to stop you, so that's definitely something that needs fixed. So the further 5 dungeons will all vary in difficulty, the 2 I suggested to be found within the current map of Hyrule being the easier ones, and the 3 out with Hyrule being much harder. Harder to reach, harder to enter, and harder on the inside. And opposed to the first 3, these 5 will all be themed. One will be located beyond the Gerudo Desert, so I think it would be fitting for that one to be a spirit or desert themed temple like in past games. Another will be located in the outer lands of Hyrule, out with the map, so some sort of jungle or forest theme would be fitting, assuming the land has been untouched and unexplored for a very long time. Another would be located out at sea, so the obvious choice here is a water dungeon, which I'm sure some people will hate on just because it's a water dungeon, but oh well. Then the 2 within Hyrule would be A, located somewhere within the Hebra mountain range making it an ice dungeon, and B, call it bold, but a Zonai temple deep within the Faron region. In total, giving us 3 introduction dungeons, followed by 5 further dungeons made up of a desert dungeon, sea dungeon, jungle dungeon, ice dungeon, and a Zonai dungeon. Keep in mind these are just my ideas, so I'm not saying that a Zonai dungeon is actually going to happen, but hey, it would be cool. These 5 further dungeons will be a real callback to traditional dungeons. I'm talking threatening enemies, mind-boggling puzzles, mini-bosses, and memorable dungeon bosses. That was also something the Divine Beast lacked on: memorability. You remember a challenging duel with a Darknut, or a terrifying swim with a deep sea monster, but you don't really remember 4 bosses that are all malice clones of each other. Sure, maybe the first one you see is cool, but once you discover literally every other dungeon boss is the same, it loses its charm. These hybrid dungeons will tackle that issue by bringing back some enemies such as Darknuts, along with introducing some new enemies. Perhaps enemies native to the outer regions of Hyrule. Oh, and if it wasn't already clear, you can leave and return these dungeons as you wish, making it even more open world. Something else I didn't mention is the rewards of the further 5 dungeons. Whilst the first 3 would give us our main key items, what would the other 5 offer outside of the information for tracking down Ganondorf? Well, here is where some compromise comes in. We've already thrown a ton of classical dungeon features in, so I think we will have to settle for just really great weapons or upgrades. If you have any ideas for more key items we could gain through these dungeons, then feel free to leave a comment below, but personally I feel like they'd be fine without them, and just the info on Ganondorf alone. So to recap what we have here in more simple terms, the game would begin with a tutorial section similar to Breath of the Wild's Great Plateau, perhaps within a cave system. Then it would lead on to the first set of dungeons, the 3 introduction dungeons. Those would give us our 3 key items for the game, along with knowledge of 5 more dungeons containing information on Ganondorf. These are classical linear style dungeons, but within an open world. Personally, I think this would fix the issue the Divine Beasts had. In all fairness, this was the developers' first attempt at a modern open world Zelda game, but the dungeons were way too simple, quick and easy, along with being too story focused, which is why I've made my idea of the hybrid dungeons something that can be done around literally everything else, whilst also connecting to the story, but without having a rush to the final boss available. So that's my idea. My idea for hybrid dungeons in the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Thanks a ton for checking out the video. I really hope you all enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to drop a like and subscribe for more Zelda content. What do you think of my ideas? Love them or hate them? Be sure to let me know, and also leave your ideas for how dungeons could work in the sequel to Breath of the Wild in the comments below. I also want to give a mention to a great video by Monster Maze discussing dungeons for the sequel, but with more of a focus on the contents of the dungeons and how all of that could work. It's a great in-depth video that I'd highly recommend checking out through the link in the description or card in the top right. This idea was actually inspired by one of your guys' comments. Big thanks to Gus January for suggesting to do a discussion on my thoughts on how dungeons will be tackled in the sequel. Another huge thank you goes to all of my wonderful Patreon supporters for your generous support to the channel. I really appreciate it, and special mention to new patron Jeff Shepstone. If you'd like to join them and support the work I do here on the channel, then check out my page through the card in the top right or link in the description. Again, thanks for watching, and until the next time, I've been Hyrule Gamer.